What's up everybody, Jesse here with VMP Performance, and today we're going to show you how to install your Odin or Loki kit on your 2018 Plus F150. Let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is disconnect our negative battery terminal. This is going to be a 10mm socket. Now we're going to remove our air intake. We're going to start with the ram air. Use a pry tool to remove the clips. And this will come out with the lower end of the box. We're going to release the clips that hold the lid on. And now we can go to the throttle body itself. Now we're going to take our 7mm and loosen the clamp. And we're going to come up here and we're going to remove the vacuum lines from the intake. Once those are out of the way, we can remove the upper portion. Now we can remove the lower portion of the cold air. This is going to be a 13mm bolt. Once the bolt is removed, you can remove the lower portion. Now we're going to remove the aspirator assembly. We're going to set it aside because we will use parts of this later. Now we can take the breather hoses out of the way. And then we can take the purge valve out of the way. You don't have to remove the purge valve completely, but we are going to set it aside. We're going to modify this later to work with our new supercharger. Now we can remove the foam covers for the fuel rails. And then we can disconnect our fuel lines. Now there will be some residual pressure built up in the rail. So we're going to remove the quick clamp. We're going to wrap the line in a piece of pig mat so that way when we remove it, we do not get sprayed with high pressure fuel. I'm going to let that sit for a minute and drain, and then we'll come back to it and remove the other side. Now that the pressure is drained out of the driver's side, we're going to remove the passenger side. You don't need to cover this side because the pressure is already out of the system. So we're going to use our quick connect release tool and remove this line. It's very important to note on this line there is one metal end and there is a plastic end attached to the direct injection pump. There is a one-way check valve in this line. If you do remove the whole line, make sure that you put it back the same way it came off or you will have drivability issues. Now that the fuel lines are out of the way, we're going to go ahead and disconnect all 8 of our injectors. And we can also disconnect our fuel rail pressure sensor. We can unplug the throttle body. And there's going to be a couple more plugs in the back, but we're going to unbolt the manifold first so we can scoot it forward a little bit so we can reach those. There are 10 bolts that hold the manifold down. 3 of them will be 8mm on each side, and then the other 2 will be 10mm bolts that hold the fuel rails. We're going to remove all 10 of these bolts, and then we can remove the intake manifold. Now that all the bolts for the intake manifold are loose, we're going to lift it and pull it forward. That way we can get to all the plugs in the back for the IMRCs. Okay, there's going to be 4 plugs in the back. You're going to slide this forward a little bit, disconnect the 3 IMRC plugs and the 1 map sensor plug. Once those are all unplugged, you're going to lift the manifold out of the way and remove it from the vehicle. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, in preparation for replacing the coolant elbow, we're going to lower the level of our coolant in the reservoir, and we're going to actually remove the reservoir from the vehicle. Normally you would do this by the drain in the bottom of your radiator. However, we have a Mighty Vac fluid evacuator we're going to use because it's a little bit easier. We're going to remove the hose from the coolant outlet, and we're going to remove the hose from the upper of the expansion tank. Now we're going to go ahead and remove the heater hose from the top of this. That'll allow us to further suction some coolant out with our Mighty Vac. There's 2 clips at the bottom. Squeeze those, and then the hose comes right off. All right, now we can remove the hose from the expansion tank to the coolant elbow. Once that is out of the way, we can remove the 2 10mm bolts that hold the expansion tank in. Then we can lift our expansion tank out of the truck. Now that the expansion tank is out of the way, we're going to go ahead and swap our coolant elbow. You're going to start by taking the 8mm bolt that holds the elbow in out. Once the bolt's out, you can remove the coolant elbow. You're just going to give it a couple of spins and a little bit of a tug, and it comes right out. Now you're going to locate the coolant elbow in your kit. Make sure you put a little bit of lube on the O-ring and replace that. You're going to take the bolt that you removed and reinstall. Now we're going to set up our belt drive system. The first thing we're going to do before we remove the belts is to loosen the water pump pulley bolts. It's going to be a 10mm socket or wrench. Once those bolts are loose, you're going to use a 15mm to release the tension on the tensioner. Pull that back towards the passenger side of the truck and remove the belt. You're going to set the accessory drive belt aside. We will reuse this later. And then we can continue to removing the water pump pulley. Once this is out of the way, we can move on to the AC belt. Now we're going to remove the AC belt. You're going to take a 3/8 drive ratchet and you're going to release the tension toward the driver's side of the vehicle. Then you can slide the belt off of the upper idler pulley and remove it from the crankshaft pulley and the AC compressor. Now before we do that, we're going to remove the tensioner itself with a 10mm bolt. You can set the tensioner aside because we will reuse it for the supercharger belt. The last thing we're going to remove is the upper idler. This is going to be a 13mm. This idler will be replaced with a 6-rib idler in your kit. Next, we're going to replace the harmonic balancer. We're going to replace this with the Mustang balancer found in your kit. The first thing we're going to do is remove the crank bolt with an 18mm socket. Make sure you remove the washer with the bolt. That way we can use our crank pulley tool to remove the balancer and not be bound up by the washer. Now we can install our crankshaft pulley removal tool and remove the harmonic balancer. Now with your crankshaft pulley removal tool installed, you can remove the pulley. Now this pulley tool is available at all of your local parts stores, whether that is Advanced Auto Parts, AutoZone, or O'Reilly's. You can rent it for the day and then return it when you're done. So now with the harmonic balancer out of the way, we have plenty of room to replace our compressor pulley. The first thing we're going to do is remove the 10mm bolt that holds the pulley on. Once the bolt is out of the way, we can remove the clutch. Be careful not to lose any shims that may be behind the clutch. They'll be inside. If you lose them, the spacing will be incorrect and your AC may not work. We're going to set this aside. Now with the clutch out of the way, we can remove the C-clip that holds the compressor pulley on, and then we can replace the pulley itself. You're going to use C-clip pliers. Now with the C-clip out of the way, we can remove the old AC pulley. And replace it with the 6-rib pulley that comes in the kit. Once that is in place, you can reinstall your C-clip, then we'll reinstall the clutch and the bolt, and then we'll move on to the harmonic balancer. Now that the bearing is installed, we'll install our clutch face. Again, make sure that your shims are in place so that the air gap is correct and the clutch will work. And we can reinstall our 10mm bolt. Now when we install the new 6-rib harmonic balancer, we're going to take a little dab of RTV and make sure it seals from any oil leaks. You'll feel the balancer drop into the keyway, and then you can install it. Now we use a special tool that you can purchase from MAF Racing, specifically designed to install balancers on Coyote engines. Now that the harmonic balancer is installed, we can start with our belt drive. The first thing we're going to install is our 6-ribbed idler pulley. You're going to install this on the notch on the timing cover. This is going to be a 13mm bolt provided. Next, we're going to remove 3 bolts from the timing cover and water pump. These are going to be 10mm head bolts. These are going to be removed so we can install our idler FEAD bracket. And you can see the 3 bolts here that we have removed. Now we're going to take our boomerang bracket with the provided hardware. These bolts are going to be 6mm Allen. The 3rd bolt is going to go through the idler pulley itself. Go ahead and tighten the first 2 bolts, and then we will install our idlers. Now the long bolt in the kit is going to be provided with a washer. You're going to stick that through the idler and install that in the 3rd hole for the bolt that you removed. The short bolt in the kit with provided washer is going to go in the upper idler. These are also 6mm Allens. Now these idler pulleys can go either way, forward or backwards. It does extend the height of the pulley, so make sure you have them installed the way you like. Tighten the bolts down and move on. After the idlers are in place, we're going to put our belt in. You're going to route this according to the diagram shown. Start with the crankshaft. We're going to go up around the smaller idler on the bottom. Then on the other side of the belt, you're going to go around the tensioner, which we have not installed yet, back down around the AC compressor, up over the 6-ribbed idler, and under the upper smooth idler. Once the belt is in place, you can install your tensioner. Make sure the belt does route around the tensioner pulley, and then you can tighten the 10mm bolt supplied with the tensioner. This is going to fit into the factory grooves on your timing cover. Now that the tensioner is in place, you're going to leave the belt routed so you can have room to slide it over the supercharger pulley. Now that the supercharger belt is in place, we're going to install our water pump pulley. You're going to go ahead and make these bolts hand tight, and once the belt is on, we're going to go back and tighten these. Now we're going to reinstall the Serpentine belt in the same position that the factory provides. You're going to go over the water pump, around the idler, over to the alternator, through the water pump, back to the tensioner, back around the crankshaft. You're going to use a 15mm to release the tension on the tensioner. Now that the belt is installed, we can go make sure that the water pump pulley bolts are tight. This will be a 10mm. Now that the belt drive is installed, we can go back up top, and we're going to remove the wire harness from the clips that hold it to the valve cover so we can pull it back a little bit and have room to set our lower head unit down. Now with our blower on the bench, we're going to move to the blower setup before we install it on the vehicle. The first step is going to be to remove the intercooler lid. We're going to set that aside. We're going to set the rest of the blower up, install it in the vehicle. The lid gets reinstalled once the bottom portion of the supercharger is installed on the vehicle. There's going to be 10mm bolts. You're going to be very careful when you lift the lid that you do not tear the gasket. All right, the first thing we're going to install is our map sensor. It's going to be supplied with the kit. Please do not use your factory map sensor that you removed from the vehicle. We're going to install a little bit of lube on the O-ring. Put that right in the blower. Going to be a 5mm Allen. Tighten that up and we're on to the next piece. Next thing we're going to install is our brass IAT sensor. We're going to use just a dab of red Loctite to seal. It's going to be a 19mm wrench. Once you make sure that is tight, you're going to look on the inside of the blower and make sure that the temperature sensor part of the sensor actually protrudes into the blower. Once the sensor is installed, we're going to plug in our harness. This is our IAT Breakout harness. One side is going to go to the temperature sensor. The other side is going to go to the map sensor. And then this side will plug into your factory harness. I'm going to leave that for now. Rotate the blower and we can install our evap provision and our map sensor block off. We're going to install our evap provision. There's an O-ring, 2 bolts in the kit. This goes on the passenger side of the inlet. And then it's going to be a 5mm Allen to tighten. Once that's done, we can move to the driver's side of the inlet and install our map block off. All right, now we're going to install our map block off with a little bit of lube. And make sure that is on every part of the O-ring. Go ahead, twist it in. Be careful not to rip the O-ring, and then install the supplied 5mm Allen. All right, now that our blower is set up, we're going to set up our fuel rails, get those installed in the blower, and then we can set that all into the truck. The first thing we're going to do, unwrap everything. You'll notice you have 6 smaller plugs, 2 big plugs, 2 3/8 quick connect fittings, 1 plug with 2 copper O-rings, 6 bolts, some super lube. We've also laid out our injectors and our fuel rail pressure sensor. Now, as far as our injectors go, if you have the Loki kit with the 56s, you'll install them as is. If you have the FIC 1000s with the Odin kit, you will remove the injector hats and then install them. So let's get started on assembly. We're going to start by installing our 6 smaller plugs. You're going to take the plugs with the supplied super lube, make sure every O-ring gets lubed, and install them in the holes. You'll notice each fuel rail has 3 threaded ports that fit the plugs, and then one finer threaded port that fits either the supplied bolt or the fuel rail pressure sensor. We're going to start everything by hand just to make sure we have them set up correctly, and then we will tighten everything. You're going to repeat the same process on both rails, the only difference being the fuel rail pressure sensor gets installed on the driver's side rail, while the plug gets installed on the passenger side rail. This is going to be our driver's side rail, so we're going to take one of the washers, put it on the sensor, and thread that into the plug. Once that's all in place, we're going to set it aside. We're going to set up our passenger side rail, and then we'll go back and we'll tighten everything. Now you're going to take the supplied plug with the copper washer, Once everything is in place, you're going to go through and you're going to tighten all the plugs. This is a 5mm Allen. I'm going to get all the main plugs tight. Then we're going to use a 16mm wrench to tighten the 3/8 EFI fitting. And then we can tighten the plug on the end. I find that a T55 Torx fits very well. Give it a gentle snug, and then move on to the other rail. Now that the fuel rails are set up and everything is tight, plugs, EFI connectors, the rear plug, and the fuel pressure sensor, we're going to install our crossover. Again, you're going to apply a little bit of lubrication to the O-rings. We're going to start them in the rails, and then we're going to use our 8AN wrench to tighten everything down. And now we can install our injectors. We're going to add lube to the tops of the O-rings, place them in one by one. All right, now that the injectors are in the rail, you're going to make sure the bottom O-rings are lubed, and then you're going to install the rail. Make sure all of the injectors sit in the buckets, and then go ahead and wiggle it into place. Now that the rail is in place, we're going to install the bolts that hold it down. There's going to be 3 bolts on each side. 5mm Allen. We're going to start each bolt before we tighten. And then go ahead and tighten all 3 bolts, and then we'll move on to the passenger side. You'll notice in the back, the crossover does go behind the map sensor and underneath the IAT sensor. Now we can fold this up out of the way, and we're ready to set our head unit on the car. Now we're going to make sure that the gaskets are installed in the supercharger. You're going to remove these gaskets from your factory manifold. If they are still pliable and look good, you will install them in your head unit. If they need to be replaced, please contact your local Ford dealer or parts store and get a new set. Now we can set the lower head unit in the vehicle. Make sure when you set it down, it does contact all surfaces of the head itself and that you are not pinching the wire harness in any place. Now before we bolt it down, we're going to lift each side and plug in our injectors, and do a couple more things, and then we can bolt the head unit down. We're going to start on the driver's side of the vehicle. We're going to lift the blower so we can get to all of our injector plugs. Once all 4 of our injectors are plugged in, we're going to plug in our fuel rail pressure sensor, and then we can plug in our fuel line. When we plug in our fuel line, we're going to make sure it is seated all the way and that the lock is engaged. And then we can set the blower back down and move on to the passenger side of the vehicle. We're going to follow the same procedure on the passenger side. We're going to lift the blower, plug in our 4 injectors, then we can plug in our fuel line, and then we can move on to our purge valve. Now we can locate our pigtail for the purge valve in the rear of the vehicle and plug in our extension harness. This is going to allow us to route the purge valve along the driver's side of the supercharger. The valve itself will be mounted to the lid once the lid is in place. Now that we're done with our setup, we can bolt our blower to the heads. There's going to be 3 long bolts and 7 short bolts. One of the short bolts is going to be located on the outside of the blower on the front of the passenger side. Make sure you get that in place. Do not drop any of your bolts inside of your engine. Get those all torqued down, and then we can move on to installing our lid. You're going to want to set the lid on as straight as possible and be sure you do not tear the gasket or the gasket does not become dislodged. Now you can reinstall all of the hardware you took out and bolt the lid back onto the lower portion of the supercharger. All right, now we're going to reinstall our lid bolts to bolt the lid down. There's a couple we're going to leave out on the driver's side. I'll show you those when we get there. Those bolts are going to hold our evap purge valve bracket and our coolant bottle for the heat exchanger system. Now we can install our purge valve standoff bracket. You're going to install this on the lid right back here. Make sure that bolt is tight, and then we're going to slide our bracket to hold the purge valve right onto it. Now that the purge valve is installed, we're going to remove the plastic hose from this end of it. We're going to use just a razor blade to cut that off, so we do want to preserve the fitting on the end. Remove this section. You're going to take the supplied rubber hose from the kit, unwrap it, install it on the end of the purge valve. And we're going to route this forward and under the supercharger inlet. Next, we're going to install the bracket on our overflow bottle for the heat exchanger system. You're going to start by removing the 3 bolts. You'll place the bracket in place and then reinstall your 3 bolts. We'll go ahead and tighten these up, and then we can install it onto the supercharger lid. Once we're on the other side of the blower, we're going to grab the end of the hose. We're going to route it in a way that will not interfere with the belt and attach it to our 90-degree nipple that we attach to the blower on the bench. Now that your bracket is attached to your overflow bottle, we're going to attach this to the supercharger lid right here. All right, now that the blower is in place, we're going to finish up our belt drive. You're going to take the spacer, insert that into the pulley that you are using with your application. Make sure the bolt holes are lined up. We're going to stick a couple of bolts in there. Install that onto the snout. Get our bolts started. And then we can go ahead and tighten them. Now that the lid is fully installed, we're going to reconnect the vacuum line for the bypass valve that we disconnected when we removed the lid for bench assembly. If you do not reconnect this line, your bypass valve will not operate correctly. All right, now that our supercharger pulley is on, we can install our belt. We're going to go up over the tensioner, down around the crankshaft, and up to this idler. On the other side, we're going to go around the AC compressor. Then we're going to go over top of the 6-rib idler, under the upper idler, and then we can release the tension on our tensioner and slide it over our upper pulley. Now we can reinstall our heater hose on the water outlet that we installed earlier. Make sure that the clamp does click into place. Once we do our heat exchanger lines, we're going to tie this back so that it does not interfere with the belt in any way. Now we can reinstall our breather hoses. And this end will go to the intake when we install that. Now we're going to move on to installing our heat exchanger. The first thing we're going to do is remove this radiator shroud. There's about a dozen push clips that hold it in. We're going to take those out so we can remove the shroud. All right, now that the shroud is out of the way, we're going to remove these 4 10mm bolts, and we're going to disconnect this harness and these 2 pigtails. Now we're going to remove the lower trim piece. There's going to be 2 7mm bolts on each side and then some push clips. So we're going to go ahead and remove the 2 bolts. We're going to go to the other side and do the same thing, and then we're going to gently pry it away from the vehicle. Set this aside in a place that it won't get scratched. Now we're going to remove 2 bolts from either side. They're going to be 8mm. Now that all the bolts are removed, we can remove the grille from the vehicle. Okay, we're going to take our prying tool and pop the inner clips loose. Once those clips are popped loose, we can grab a hold of the cover and pull. To release the rest of the clips. Now that we've removed the two outer covers to get to our bolts, we're going to go ahead and remove the center grille so that we have a direct path of airflow to our heat exchanger. This just presses into place. We're going to modify this cover and then we'll reinstall it when we're done. Now that the covers are removed, you're going to locate a couple of 21mm nuts. We're going to remove these so that we can install our heat exchanger brackets. Now we can take our heat exchanger bracket. You're going to take the bolt retainer from the back side of the nuts that we just removed and put that in place. Then you can slide the whole bracket in, reinstall your 21mm nuts, and then we'll have one more bolt to install on the back side of the bracket. Then we can install the other side, and then we can install the heat exchanger itself. Now we can take the supplied bolt and install this in the rear of the heat exchanger bracket. There's going to be a hole in the frame. You can take the supplied nut, go in from the bottom of the frame, and get the back of the bracket secure. Once you've got the nut started, we're going to take a ratchet, we're going to tighten everything up. You're going to repeat this process on the passenger side. All right, this lower valance is going to have to be trimmed to fit our heat exchanger. There's a couple of grooves on either side. Those are going to be our marks. They line up with the brackets. So we're going to cut on the outside of the mark, across the front of the condenser, down the other side. Once that is trimmed, we can slide our heat exchanger in. Now there are many ways you can trim this. I'm going to use a set of snips just to make my marks. Then I'll make my final cuts and you'll see the final result. Now we're going to set up our heat exchanger. As you can see, I've already installed most of the bushings. You're going to take the sleeve, slide it into the center, and install that right there on the heat exchanger. Once those are all in place, we can slide it into the vehicle, start our bolts, and tighten everything up. All right, now we're going to take our upper bolt with a washer on it, slide it through the heat exchanger bracket. Then you're going to take another washer and then the nut. You're going to repeat this on all four corners. Once those are in place, go ahead and tighten everything. All right, now that the heat exchanger is in place and bolted down, we're gonna install our upper hose before we reinstall our grill. What we're gonna do is take a hole saw and drill a hole right here in this shroud to run our hose into the engine compartment. Before you drill this, please take a look behind and make sure you're not drilling into any wires or the radiator, AC lines, anything important. I've already checked behind, I've made my mark, so I'm gonna drill a hole and then route the hose. Now we're going to take one of our hoses, slide it into the engine bay. I'm going to reach around the top and guide it into the place that we want. Once that side is in place, we can come back down, attach it to our heat exchanger, and install the clamp. Once the clamp is in place, you're going to make sure that your hose will not kink, and we can reinstall our front grille. Now with our modifications to the active grille done, we can reinstall the front grille. Now you're going to reinstall the bolts in the same order that they came out. Now we can install our upper radiator shroud. I'm going to put this back in place and install all of the push clips that we removed earlier. Our next step is going to be to cut and install our intercooler hoses. Supplied in the kit is a hose cutter and 7 hoses. You're going to use the 6 short ones to make your hoses up here. The long hose is going to go from the bottle to the intercooler pump itself. So we're going to go ahead and get started, make a couple of cuts, route them to our Ys, follow the diagram, and it'll be easy to route. You're going to make sure you put your hose clamp here. This is a shrinkable hose clamp. We're going to use a heat gun later to shrink that, but we're going to wait until all the hoses are in place before we finalize that. When you route your hoses, make sure that you route them with enough slack that they do not kink in any place. If they kink, you're going to restrict your intercooler flow. You'll have high IATs and you risk damaging your engine and supercharger. Now that we have our hoses in place, we have a general idea of where they all intersect. We're going to cut and put in our Y at this point. We're going to feed the single inlet and come out of the dual outlets to the intercooler. This ensures that we have even flow to both sides and that our IATs stay in check and even on both banks. Now that the hoses are installed, we can final install our clamps and then we can move on to the upper outlets of the intercoolers. We're going to follow the same pattern except we're going to go to the driver's side so we can connect to our overflow bottle. Now these are going to feed into the dual inlets of your Y and out of the single outlet to the Degas bottle. All right, after trimming to our application, we're going to install the upper hoses. Make sure your clamps are in place. We're going to route these to the driver's side of the vehicle. That way we can attach to our overflow bottle. Now with our upper hoses in place, we can install our Y, and then we will install the last hose that goes to the overflow bottle. All right, now that we've installed our upper hoses, we've got our Y in. This is routed underneath the cold air intake. Nice long swooping curve so we have no kinks in the system. We're going to install our hose that connects it to the expansion tank. Now that our hoses are all routed, we can heat shrink our clamps. Now that all the hoses from the lid are attached to the bottle, we can attach our hose that's going to feed our intercooler pump. You're going to attach this to the back side of the bottle. And then you're going to route it down to where the intercooler pump is going to be mounted. All right, now we're going to mount our intercooler pump. There's going to be a couple of different options depending on your kit, but we're generally going to mount it in this area. For our Loki kit, we have the regular Bosch style pump, so we need 2 mounting points. We've inserted 2 U-clips into the truck. We have a spacer and some clamps. We're going to mount this right here. We're going to add the second clamp for stability. Now that our pump is mounted, we can make the connection to our heat exchanger and we can attach our hose from the reservoir. All right, now that the feed line is connected, we can attach the hose from the bottle. Now that the last hose is in place, you're going to double check for kinks. And then we've finalized our hose system. Now we're going to move on to wiring of the intercooler pump. All right, now with our harness, you're gonna take it out of the package. You're gonna start with the intercooler pump. We're gonna take that plug, dip it right over here, and plug it into the pump. Again, with different configurations, you may need to put the supplied jumper in between this and the high flow pump. On the Loki application, we do not need the high flow pump. We plug it straight in. Another thing you'll notice is we have a non-fanned heat exchanger in for this application. The harness does have 2 provisions for fans. You can always add fans later if you'd like. We're gonna skip over that part for now, and we're gonna go straight to our relays and wiring up top at the fuse box. Now that we've got our harness routed up through the engine bay, up near the battery and fuse box, we're gonna do a couple things. First, we're gonna take our relays, we're gonna zip tie them to the harness here so that they are accessible. Then you'll notice a ground. We're gonna attach this directly to our battery terminal once that is back in place. You have 2 fuses, power wire, and the jumper wire that goes to the fuse box. We're gonna run this over to the fuse box, and then we'll come back to that. But let's start by getting these zip tied in place. Now we can move to the fuse box. You're gonna remove the lid. And then you're gonna take the instruction sheet that you got in your heat exchanger harness. Follow the directions for 2018, 2019 F150. This works for 2020 as well. You're gonna replace the fuse specified, which is gonna be fuse number 36 for this application. We'll replace that with the supplied fuse with the jumper on it. Once that's replaced, we're gonna plug in our jumper wire, and we're gonna attach our power wires to the power right here on the end of the fuse box. Once your jumper is swapped over to the fuse, you're gonna reinstall it in the same position you took it out. Then you can take your orange wire and plug it in. Now we're going to remove the 10mm nut on the power to the fuse box. You're going to take your 2 power jumpers from the harness. Place those on the peg and then reinstall your 10mm nut. Once this is reinstalled, you're going to route your wire so that it can exit the fuse box and reinstall all your covers. Now that the rest of the harness is hooked up, we're going to crack this 13mm nut, which we've already done, so we can attach our ground. We're going to do this simply so we do not forget to do it later. Attach your ground here, reinstall the nut. Make sure you properly torque it when you attach it back to the battery. Okay, for your Odin installation, you're going to take your twin 69 or your monoblade throttle body that you got with the kit, depending on your options. You're going to take the gasket and your throttle body hardware kit. You're going to install that directly on the inlet of the Supercharger. Make sure when you install the gasket that you do not pinch it or squeeze the gasket out in any areas. This will cause a vacuum leak and you will have problems with tuning. Now that the throttle body is installed, you're going to take your 6-inch jumper harness, plug that into the throttle body, then you'll locate the factory plug for your throttle body and plug that in. Make sure you route that in a way so it will not rub against the belt drive. All right, now we're going to modify our aspirator assembly so that we can plug in our brake booster hose and our 4-wheel drive vacuum solenoids. The only hoses we're going to modify are these two right here. We're going to remove the hose for the IMRCs, and we're going to take this off and replace it with a rubber hose that we attach to the brass nipple on the inlet of our supercharger. You can remove these with a razor blade, make a small cut. Once this end is capped, we're going to take the provided hose, attach it to this section, and then we'll run it to the inlet on our blower, cut to length once we install it in the truck. Now we can install our Odin cold air kit. Get your clamp tight, then we can reattach our aspirator and we can attach our breather hose from the valve cover. Now that you've modified your aspirator assembly, we're going to go ahead and reinstall that in the truck. Start by attaching your brake booster. We're going to take our vacuum line for the 4-wheel drive, reattach that into all the positions, reattach our 2 vacuum nipples, and we can move to the other side of the assembly. This side will get attached to the intake, and this side is going to run to the brass nipple on the inlet of the supercharger. We're going to get this routed in place, cut to fit, and then attach it where we'd like. Now if you have the Loki kit, we're going to show you how to install your throttle body and intake. If you do have the Odin kit, you can go ahead and skip forward a couple of minutes and you'll see how to install your options on this vehicle. We're going to start by installing the adapter plate for the throttle body. You're going to make sure the O-ring is in, seated properly. You're going to make sure your gasket is on the back of the adapter plate. Run your bolts through. Make sure you do not pinch your gasket when you install it. Go ahead and get that installed on the inlet of the supercharger. It's going to be a 5mm Allen. Now that our adapter plate is installed, we can install our stock throttle body. Now that the throttle body is installed, you're going to take your 6-inch jumper supplied in the kit, locate your factory throttle body harness, and plug those in. You're going to want to make sure that that is routed in a way that will not interfere with the belt drive. Now we can reinstall our stock air box. You're going to locate the grommets, make sure it's seated. Then we can reinstall our 2 clips up here and our 13mm bolt up here. Now we're going to reinstall the upper portion of our factory air box. Now we can reinstall our factory expansion tank. You're going to make sure you connect this hose to the coolant elbow. You can run this hose back to the nipple on top of the coolant outlet. And then you're going to install these 2 spacers for your bottle that slide it to the passenger side of the vehicle just a couple inches to clear the new throttle body. You're going to take your bolt and then your spacer, put that right into your new bracket. You're going to repeat the process on the other side. The last thing we can do is reconnect the hose from the radiator. First, we're going to remove the jack to give ourselves a little bit of extra space to work. Now that the jack is out of the way, we can remove the rear padding on the firewall. We're just going to fold this to the side. And you'll find your vent and a good ground location for your FPDM. We're going to mount the FPDM in this area. That way it's nice and concealed and we can run it easily through our vent. All right, we want to mount this in a spot that we will be able to easily reach our ground to our factory ground location, which is going to be right here. Now we can take an 8mm socket, remove the ground, and attach that. Now that the ground is in place, we can take our extension for our truck and we can insert that into the cab vent. This is going to drop the harness just near the FPDM where we want it. We'll have to get under the truck and route it. What we're going to do is cut away one of the supports in the middle of this vent. That way we can slide our pigtail through into the outside of the vehicle. When you push it through, you're going to want to push it to the outside of the vehicle so that it will clear the bed. You can reach in from the underside of the vehicle and pull the harness the rest of the way through. Before we pull it all the way through, we're going to plug it in to our FPDM. Tuck this away. Once we get everything situated, we'll put the interior of the truck back together. All right, so now we're going to remove the FPDM from our vehicle. There's going to be a 10mm bolt on each side and one pigtail connector on the other side. We're going to remove this so we can modify our connector to fit our jumper harness. Now that our FPDM is on the table, you'll see the one tab that needs to be removed. This tab is going to be also removed on the jumper harness itself. That way we can plug it into the vehicle. Now that we've trimmed both connectors, you want to make sure they plug in together easily. Hear that snap, and we can reinstall it in the vehicle. Now we can reinstall the FPDM in the vehicle. Now we're going to take our factory plug and plug that into our jumper. Make sure you hear the click. Then we're going to take the extension harness that we ran from inside of the vehicle. We're going to plug that into the jumper harness as well. Once that is plugged in, we're going to route that across the frame rail. Pull any slack of it back up into the cab. That way we make sure it does not touch any exhaust and burn through. All right, now that everything is in place, we can reinstall our carpet. Then we can reinstall our toolkit, close the seat, and we are done with the fuel pump booster. Now we can install the supplied lower grille. Now we can reinstall the covers on these sides. Now the next step in our Loki installation is this intake pipe. You're going to put it in place, make sure your clamps are tight, attach your breather hose, and the line from your brake aspirator. Once that's in place, we can reconnect the battery, fill our fluids, and finish the installation. Now we're going to reconnect our negative battery terminal. Now we can fill our fluids and test for intercooler flow. Now we're going to fill our cooling system. We're going to use a vacuum filler, that way we don't have any air bubbles in the system. Now we're going to load the tune, turn the key on, double check that we've bled this system properly, and good to go. You can clearly see we have good flow in the intercooler reservoir. Now we can put the cap back on and turn the key off. Go ahead and pull out your factory spark plugs. Now we're going to check the condition of these and gap them for boost. We recommend anywhere between 25 and 28 thousandths, but you always want to double check with your tuner to see where they want the plugs. Okay, now your Loki or Odin kit is installed on your F150. Go ahead and load your tune at this point, start data logging for your tuner. If you're interested in a Loki or Odin kit for your F-150, go ahead and contact our sales and support line or get a hold of us on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube.